everyone! I realized after creating that entire long video on literally everything you need to know to start embroidery that there was one little thing I hadn't covered because it doesn't actually happen before your first stitch: knotting the thread on the back of the fabric. But it's a super necessary part of the embroidery process, so we are going to go through the two main ways I tie off my thread when I'm done sewing or when I get to the end of the piece that I've cut. And stick around because I've had a lot of requests to see the back of my first sampler, so this seemed like a good time to look at hoop butts and discuss why and how they differ. I've set up 4 different scenarios here to show you my methods of tying off my thread, and I want to preface by saying there are many other methods that other people use and that you may prefer, so I'm just showing my main go-tos here. Here I've got 3 strands of floss sewn in a bit of stem stitch with plenty of leftover thread on the needle. Up here I am still using 3 strands, but for this example I've come to the end of my piece of thread and there's not much left. I also wanted to show how things can be different if you are using a single strand of floss, so that's over here. And then finally, I did a few knots with 3 strands to look at the best method when your stitches are really far apart from each other. Let's start with the most basic method I use to tie off my thread. I finished the design and now I want to secure it so it won't come undone, so I'm going to slip my needle underneath 1 or more strands of floss here on the back of the piece. And then before I pull my thread all the way through, I'm taking the needle back through the loop created here. You could go through in either direction, both will work. Then repeat the process, back under some threads, back through the loop. 2 times is enough to create a solid knot and secure your thread permanently, and then you can snip off the rest. I like to leave about 1 inch of extra thread just to be safe. Now sometimes I get to the very end of a piece of thread and there really isn't enough length left for me to do the under and through the loop method. As long as you're using multiple strands of floss, you can use a secondary method, which I like to call tying a knot. Seriously, just separate your strands and start tying them into knots. The reason this isn't what I always do is that you aren't tying this knot around anything, so it's just not as secure. Pay attention to how big the knot is when you finish compared to the weave of your fabric. If you're using a loose weave, that knot will have to be pretty big in order to prevent it sliding back through the fabric. I'm going to tie this one 4 times to make sure it's big enough to hold my thread down securely. Of course, if you're only using 1 strand of floss, that's not an option, so make sure you are leaving yourself enough thread to tie it off properly. If you don't have many or any threads around your ending point to tie the knot around, you can also go through the fabric itself. This is going to leave a bit of a stitch on the top of the fabric, so it's best to only use this method if you know for sure that you'll be covering the fabric entirely with stitches later on. This is the same exact method as the first one I showed you, but you'll take the needle through a few of the fibers of the fabric itself rather than underneath your own floss. Then it's just the same, underneath and through the loop. Again, you want to be doing it at least twice to make it really secure. Lastly, I just wanted to show what can happen if you're stitching something like knots. As you can see here, there's just a few pieces of thread on the back, and they aren't the strongest thing to secure the end of your floss to. When you're tying your knot around a long, single piece of floss like this, you just want to make sure that you are always pulling towards the end of the stitch, really sliding that knot as close to the base of that thread rather than letting it float around somewhere in the middle. So those are the various ways that I personally tie off my floss when I finish stitching. Like I said before, there are many other methods, and one reason that some stitchers do not like the methods I just showed is because they do leave a bump on the back where that knot is. This has never mattered to me because of the way I frame or finish my pieces, but if you're ever planning to stretch a piece of embroidery over a hard surface, like if you're framing it on top of a piece of wood or making a book cover or anything like that, you will have a lumpy surface due to all the knots on the back. And speaking of the back, let's look at some hoop butts. I just wanted to show you a couple of the back sides from pieces I've stitched in the past, including the sampler that my last series of tutorials covered. So I think when you're first starting embroidery, it's easy to forget the back even exists or just think of it as a giant mess that you don't want to look at. But I actually find the hoop butts really fascinating and quite beautiful. They're kind of like the duck's feet paddling underwater, you know, because they show the amount of work that went into your piece a little more than the front does sometimes. Some things to consider when you're starting a piece is how you'll be framing or finishing it in the end if you're planning to do so. If you're stitching on clothing, you might want to use a stabilizer on the back. If you'll be framing against a hard surface, you need to consider how lumpy the backside is. If you're using a thinner fabric and dark thread, you have to keep in mind how much that thread will show through to the front side. That's a really common issue I've both heard and experienced. Sewing with black thread on white fabric and seeing all your in-between lines from the back of the fabric showing through. Sometimes framing can fix that, like using a dark colored fabric against the back to prevent light coming through and really highlighting those in-between stitches. And other times you just need to plan your stitches with that in mind and tie off your thread really frequently and start a new piece anytime there's going to be a gap in between your stitches. This piece is especially kind of crazy looking, I know. This is actually a piece that I did when I was stitching through a book of embroidery stitches and learning a bunch of them for the first time. So there's something like, I think 87 different stitches on this one hoop, and then I did a second one that had like the remaining 67. I don't know, it was a lot of stitches. But I particularly love the back of this hoop. I love the front as well, but I particularly love the back because you can see how every single different stitch creates such a different look on the back of your hoop. And it's really interesting to see where your thread is going in between all of the places you want it to go on the front of the hoop. Here is the sampler that I stitched for all of my previous tutorial videos. I've gotten a lot of questions about the thread saver stitches I showed and how they actually save thread and why you would use them, etc. So let's take a look at the back of the satin stitch circle. You can see that this is the proper satin stitch section where I looped the thread all the way around from the top of the circle to the bottom and back to the top. So there's a solid amount of thread here on the back, and that's making the satin stitch really stable. But in the other half, there's a lot less thread on the back. There's just these short stitches around the edge of the circle, and that's because I went back and forth across the circle rather than up and down from top to bottom. So this satin stitch isn't quite as stable as the proper way, but if I had been running out of this color of thread and trying to conserve, or I just didn't want all that thread on the back for whatever reason, this option is really helpful. You can see a similar thing happening up here with the back stitch, which I also did in both proper and thread saver ways. The proper way has multiple layers of thread on top of each other, actually more thread on the back of the fabric than is on the front, whereas the thread saver way just has this running stitch happening. So the amount of thread on the back is cut in, well, more than in half, which is sometimes just better for what you're doing in the moment. Last of all, I just wanted to show this piece I finished recently, mostly because I'm really proud of it. This piece took me 9 months to complete, and the entire front is covered in thread, often with multiple layers on top of each other, so I think the back of this piece is just gorgeous as well. You can see where there are a few gaps in the back, and you can see the fabric through depending on what type of stitch I was doing. Up here I did a brick stitch, which is basically rows of back stitch offset from each other, and you can tell that in some places I was doing proper back stitch, and in others I started doing the thread saver. That's because I was really concerned that I was going to run out of this color of thread with such a huge area to cover, and also I was getting bored and trying to mix things up. In other areas, there are huge amounts of thread in one place because of all the little details, and it was actually getting difficult in some places to get a needle through the bulk I had created here on the back in order to stitch those last few outlines and details. So there you go. If you needed to know how to tie off your thread, I hope this video was helpful to you, and if you keep trying to cover your hoop butts because you think the mess of thread is ugly, I hope you look at all that hard work in a new way and see how beautiful it is. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope you will join me for my upcoming chain stitch variation tutorials. I had a lot of fun designing the sampler, learning new stitches, making the pattern, and then creating all these tutorials, and I cannot wait to share them with you. See you guys later!